Hi guys, ready for chapter 5 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? So when we left off in chapter 4, Edmund had gotten into the wardrobe and he met the White Witch. Lucy went back into Narnia as well through the wardrobe, and she said that she saw Mr. Tumnus again. Even though we didn't hear very much about that in chapter 4, she did say that Mr. Tumnus was okay, and she thought that the White Witch hadn't found out that he had met her and let her go. So she thought Mr. Tumnus was going to be safe. But we know that when Edmund was talking to the White Witch, he told her that his sister had been there and met a fawn. And we're not going to get to find out in chapter 5 what happens to Mr. Tumnus. We'll have to wait till chapter 6 for that one. But right now in chapter 5, we're going to find out what happens when Edmund and Lucy get back to the professor's house and tell Peter and Susan that they've both been to Narnia. Well, Lucy's going to tell them that. We'll see what Edmund does. Ready? Chapter 5, back on this side of the door. Because the game of hide-and-seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out. "Peter! Susan! It's all true! Edmund has seen it too! There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there, in the wood. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it." "What's all this about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. You see, up until that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only 1 year's difference between them. And then he gave a little snigger and said, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all of her story about the country and the wardrobe is true, just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." He knows Narnia's real. He's been there. But he lies to Peter and Susan and tells them that it's not real, that it's all make-believe, that they were just pretending. Can you imagine how Lucy feels right now? Poor Lucy. She gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success. And he went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of younger kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up! You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since we started this nonsense about this wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going crazy in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. But whichever one it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and teasing her and then encouraging her the next?" said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. You didn't think at all, said Peter. It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now. Do stop it, said Susan. It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy. It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story. See, Lucy knows she's telling the truth, right? I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you are all beasts, beasts! It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage, talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father, and if he thinks there is really something wrong with Lou, said Peter, it's getting beyond us. So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, Come in. And he got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. That means he has time to talk to them. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting till they had finished their whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. How do you know, he asked, that your sister's story is not true? Oh, but, began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, But Edmund said they'd only been pretending. That is a point, said the professor, which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the most reliable? I mean, which one is the more truthful? Well, that's just the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now, I'd have said Lucy every time. What do you think, my dear? Said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true. All this stuff about the wood and the fawn. That is more than I know, said the professor. As a charge of lying against someone whom you've always found truthful is a very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it might not even be lying, said Susan. We thought maybe there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean? Said the professor quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she's not mad. Now, that doesn't mean angry. It means like crazy. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and actually believe Lucy. She didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach you all logic at school? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, crazy. Or she's telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies. It is obviously that she's not mad. For the moment then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume she is telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend like there was. What has that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor. And Peter did not know quite what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours. That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you, this is a very strange house. Even I know very little about it. If I say she had got into another world, I should not be at all surprised to find out that that other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think very many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable amount of time before coming out and telling her story. But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles. Spectacles are glasses. And beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself. I wonder what they do teach them at these schools. There's a professor with the kids. But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up at them with very sharp expression on his face. He looked at both of them. There is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, said he. And that was the end of the conversation. That's what my grandma would have said, right? After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject. And so, for a time, it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see it. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in history books. And well it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I'm telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on the first morning, along with a good many other instructions, "And please remember, you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking visitors around the house." Here is a picture of that house in the country. You can see there's some visitors coming right now. Visitors are coming to see. I'm going to walk up to the house. They want to go on a tour. They want to see it. The kids are going to have to stay out of the way. Just if any of us would want to waste half of the morning trailing around with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund. The other three thought the same. That was how the adventure began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it apart when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Look out! Here comes the McCready!" and the whole group with her. "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all four of them made off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they had got out into the green room, and beyond it into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them, and realized that Mrs. McCready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs, instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Mrs. McCready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house was coming to life and was chasing them into Narnia, suddenly they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother! Here, let's get into the wardrobe room until they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling to open the door. And then they saw the handle turning. "Quick!" said Peter. "There's nowhere else!" And he flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it all the way, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never, never shut yourself into a wardrobe. And that's the end of chapter 5. What do you think's going to happen? We'll have to find out when we read chapter 6. Chapter 6 is called Into the Forest. You want to tell us your predictions? Put them in the comments. Okay, have a great day. Love and miss you guys. Bye.